The highway was silent except for the wind. 16-year-old Zaria didn't scream when her stepfather's hand pressed against her shoulder. She didn't beg when the SUV door opened onto the frozen night. She had learned years ago that her voice didn't matter. The car disappeared into the storm before she even hit the ground. Red taillights, then nothing. For years, she had convinced herself it was love wrapped in discipline, that the hunger was teaching her gratitude, that the bruises were her fault. But tonight, after a phone call that made Marcus Hale's voice go sharp and cold, she finally understood. She wasn't family. She was overhead, and overhead gets cut. Snow settled into her natural curls, turning them to ice. Her thin coat, the same one she'd worn for 3 winters, did nothing against the temperature plummeting around her. And cars passed. None stopped. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes. Then the edges of her vision began to blur white. That was when the convoy appeared. 3 black sedans cutting through the blizzard in perfect formation, headlights like predator eyes. Inside the center vehicle sat Kang Jun-hyuk, a man the Korean underworld whispered about with equal parts fear and respect. He was en route to a merger that could stabilize half the city's underground economy. A meeting he had orchestrated for 6 months. His driver slowed. "Sir, someone on the road." Jun-hyuk didn't look up from his file. "Roadkill?" "A girl, sir." His eyes lifted, and in the brutal glare of the headlights he saw her, small, still, half buried in white. Something ancient and unwanted stirred in his chest, a memory he'd buried in concrete and blood. He opened the door before his mind could override his body. His lieutenants exchanged glances. Their boss didn't stop. Not for strangers, not for sentiment, not ever. But Kang Jun-hyuk walked into the storm anyway, his tailored black coat whipping in the wind as he knelt beside the girl. When he turned her face toward him, her eyes fluttered open for half a second. Not fear, not hope, just exhaustion, and something worse, acceptance. He knew that look. He had worn it once, in a shipping container, with the air running out. "She's alive," he said quietly, his hand, gloveless now, pressed against her ice-cold cheek. "Cancel the meeting." The silence that followed was deafening. "Sir, this deal has taken 6 months." "Cancel it." He lifted her himself, cradling her like something fragile instead of something thrown away. To the world, and Zaria was disposable. To the man who stopped his convoy on Highway 17, she had just become the most dangerous thing in his life. An investment he didn't plan to make. Hello, family. Welcome to Soul Noir Crown. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when a throwaway girl becomes a mafia boss's reason to burn the world down. Now, let's continue with the story. The warmth that greeted Zaria when consciousness finally returned wasn't what she expected. No harsh hospital fluorescence, no social worker with a clipboard and rehearsed sympathy, no police officer asking questions she couldn't answer. Just marble ceilings, soft golden lamplight, the weight of heated blankets cocooning her body like she was something worth protecting. An IV line fed fluids into her arm with methodical gentleness. And across the room, seated perfectly still in a leather chair that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned, was the man from the snow. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't cold either. "You were on Highway 17, he said, his voice calm and measured, like they were discussing the weather instead of her near death, in a blizzard that kills people in under an hour. Her throat was sandpaper. "I know." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, simple, direct, impossible to answer without unraveling everything. She hesitated. Years of training, of Marcus's sharp corrections and Linda's disappointed silences, told her not to complain, not to cause trouble, not to make herself a problem someone would have to solve. "I wasn't wanted," she whispered, the words barely audible. Something shifted in Kang Jun-hyuk's expression. Not pity. He didn't strike her as a man who trafficked in pity, but recognition. Like he'd heard those words before, maybe even said them himself. He didn't respond immediately, just stood, moved to the window and looked out at the city sprawling below them in a glittering maze of light and shadow. "Rest," he said finally. "We'll talk when you're stronger." But Jun-hyuk didn't need to talk to Zarya to understand what had happened. Within 48 hours, he knew everything. And what he learned made him decide that Marcus Hale's comfortable life was about to end in the most thorough, devastating way possible. Because Zarya's stepfather wasn't just cruel. He was greedy, desperate, and stupid enough to think a 16-year-old girl had no value beyond what he could extract from her. He had no idea who was about to come for him, or what he'd unleashed the night he threw her into the snow. But to understand why a man like Kang Jun-hyuk would stop his convoy for a dying stranger, you need to understand what that convoy meant. It never stopped. Not for police checkpoints, not for traffic, not for anything that didn't involve blood or money, and even then, rarely both. The 3 black sedans moved through the blizzard like surgical instruments, maintaining perfect formation despite the white chaos screaming around them. Inside the center vehicle, silence was law. Jun-hyuk's driver kept his eyes forward. His bodyguard in the passenger seat hadn't spoken in 40 minutes. In the back, 2 lieutenants flanked their boss, tablets glowing softly in the darkness. Kang Jun-hyuk sat motionless, his tailored black coat sharp against the leather seats, eyes scanning merger documents that represented 6 months of delicate negotiation. The Park Syndicate controlled the northern ports. The Choi family owned the southern logistics networks. Both had been bleeding each other dry for 3 years. Tonight's meeting would end that war. Tonight would reshape the city's entire underground economy. He didn't tolerate distractions, couldn't afford them. "Sir?" The driver's voice was careful, hesitant in a way that made Jun-hyuk's jaw tighten. "There's someone on the road." Jun-hyuk didn't look up. "Roadkill?" "No, sir. A girl." His pen stopped moving across the contract. Just for a second. "Plenty of girls in the world. Keep driving." But the convoy was already slowing, and that made him look. Through the tinted window, past the violent sheets of snow, the headlights illuminated something small and dark against the white. A figure, collapsed, half buried, his chest constricted. The file in his hand suddenly weighed nothing. "Sir?" the driver prompted quietly. Jun-hyuk leaned forward, his breath catching in a way he hadn't felt in 15 years. The girl's arm was visible, extended slightly, fingers curled like she'd been reaching for something. Snow had settled into her hair, dark curls turned white, crystallized. But it was her face that stopped his heart. Even unconscious, even dying, there was something in her expression. Not peace, not surrender. Acceptance. The look of someone who had learned not to expect rescue. He knew that look, had worn it himself once in a shipping container on the docks, 11 years old and running out of air. The look that said, "This is what I deserve." "Sir, if we don't move now, we'll be late." "Stop the car." "The meeting." I said stop. The convoy halted in unison. Brake lights flaring red in the storm. His lieutenants exchanged glances. In 3 years of working under Kang Jun-hyuk, they had never seen him deviate from a plan. Never. He didn't wait for them to open his door. He just moved. The cold hit him like a fist, vicious, immediate, stealing breath. Snow whipped against his face as he stepped onto the highway, his expensive shoes sinking into the drift. His men scrambled out behind him, confused, alarmed. "Sir, you can't." But he was already kneeling beside her. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought. 16, maybe. Her coat was laughably thin, torn at one shoulder. Her lips had gone blue. When he touched her neck, checking for a pulse, her skin was ice. But she was alive. Barely. He turned her face gently, and her eyes fluttered open for half a second. Unfocused, glazed. But in that moment before they closed again, he saw it. No fear, no panic, no hope. Just that terrible, familiar acceptance. His hand was shaking when he pulled it back. He hadn't noticed he'd removed his gloves. "Cancel the meeting," he said quietly. The world seemed to stop. "Sir." His lead lieutenant, Min Jun, stepped forward carefully, like approaching a wild animal. "The Park and Choi families have been waiting for this merger for 6 months. If we don't show, cancel it. They'll see it as weakness. They'll test us. Sir, please." Jun-hyuk stood, lifting the girl in one smooth motion. She weighed almost nothing, like something already half gone from this world. "Let them test," he said, his voice colder than the storm. "I'll be ready." He carried her to the car himself, and cradling her against his chest as snow gathered on his shoulders. His men stared, frozen in disbelief. Their boss, the man who had once walked away from a bleeding ally because stopping would have compromised a deal, was holding a dying stranger like she mattered. "Reroute to the penthouse," Jun-hyuk ordered as he slid into the back seat, still holding her. "Get Dr. Shin there in 20 minutes. Move." The convoy turned around in perfect synchronization. Behind them, the highway stretched empty. Ahead, the city lights glowed through the storm. And in a private room, where two rival syndicate heads waited with expensive whiskey and loaded questions, phones began to ring with a message that would change everything. Kang Jun-hyuk didn't show. He stopped his convoy. For a girl. The rumors started immediately. By morning, every player in the underworld would know. The man who never stopped had stopped. And that meant he was either weak or about to become very, very dangerous. Zarya woke to silence. Not the oppressive kind she'd grown used to in the Hale house. The silence of being ignored, of taking up too little space to matter. This was different. Expensive. The kind of quiet that only existed when the world had been carefully designed to keep chaos out. Her eyes opened slowly, fighting against the weight of exhaustion that still clung to her bones. Above her stretched a ceiling of cream-colored marble veined with gold, catching soft light from sources she couldn't immediately identify. For a confused moment, she thought she was dead. Then the pain registered. Dull, distant, but present. Her fingers tingled, her toes ached. Her throat felt raw. She turned her head carefully and saw the IV line feeding into her arm. Medical equipment hummed quietly beside the bed, not the industrial kind from hospitals, but sleek, almost invisible. The bed itself was enormous, covered in blankets so soft they felt like warm air against her skin. This wasn't a hospital. She tried to sit up, panic fluttering in her chest. Where were the social workers? The police officers with their rehearsed sympathy and inevitable questions? Where was the group home she'd always known she'd end up in? "I wouldn't move too quickly." The voice came from the shadows near the window, calm and measured. Zarya's head snapped toward it, her heart hammering. He sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than the Hales' entire living room, perfectly still, hands folded in his lap. The man from the snow. Tailored black suit, dark hair swept back, eyes that gave away nothing. "Where am I?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Safe." That's not an answer. Something that might have been approval flickered across his expression. "My home. You've been unconscious for 18 hours. Dr. Shin says you're lucky to be alive." Zarya looked around again, at the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a city sprawled below them, at the pristine furniture, at the art on the walls that looked like it belonged in a museum. Nothing made sense. "Why am I here? Why not a hospital?" Hospitals ask questions. He stood moving to the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. Questions lead to investigations. Investigations take time. You needed treatment immediately. "So you just brought me here?" "Yes." She stared at him, trying to reconcile the clinical efficiency in his voice with the fact that he'd apparently saved her life. I don't understand." "You don't need to." He turned to face her fully. "What you need is rest, food, and time to recover. Everything else can wait." But Zarya had learned long ago that nothing came for free. People didn't help without wanting something back. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing." Nobody does something like this for nothing. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe respect. "Smart. You're right to be suspicious." He crossed the room, stopping a careful distance from the bed, close enough to talk, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. "I stopped because I wanted to," he said simply. "What happens next is your choice." Zarya's throat tightened. Choice. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had given her that. Why were you on Highway 17? He asked, his voice softer now. Not gentle. She suspected this man didn't do gentle, but careful. In a blizzard that should have killed you in minutes. The question hung in the air between them. She could lie, make something up, protect the people who'd thrown her away, because that's what she'd been trained to do. But looking at this stranger who'd stopped his entire life to pull her from the snow, the truth came easier than expected. I wasn't wanted, she whispered. 4 words, but they carried 7 years of weight. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned back to the window, silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, rougher, like the words were costing him something. I was 11 when they locked me in a shipping container. Punishment for stealing food I needed to survive. He paused. I wasn't wanted either. Zaria's breath caught. He didn't look at her when he continued. Someone opened that door, someone I didn't know, who had no reason to care. He gave me a choice. Die there, or survive long enough to make sure no one ever had that power over me again. What did you choose? I'm still here. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, like an understanding passing between them without words. Finally, he moved toward the door. Rest. There's staff if you need anything. Press the button beside the bed. Wait. Zaria's voice stopped him. Who are you? He looked back, and for the first time, something almost human crossed his features. Kang Junhyuk, and you're Zaria Hale, though I suspect you won't be keeping that name much longer. How did you... I know everything about the people who hurt you. His voice went cold again, clinical. Within 48 hours, I'll know everything about the life they stole from you, too. He left without another word, the door closing with a soft, final click. Alone again, Zaria stared at the ceiling. She should be terrified, should be planning escape routes, should be questioning everything. But all she felt was warm, and for the first time in 7 years, not alone. Outside, Junhyuk pulled out his phone and dialed. Minjun, I need a complete background investigation. Subject, Zaria Hale, age 16. Family history, financial records, legal guardianship paperwork, everything. I want to know who discarded her and why. A pause. And Minjun? I want to know what they took from her, because I'm going to make them give it back. He ended the call and stared out at the city below. The syndicates thought he'd shown weakness. They had no idea what he'd just declared war for. The file landed on Junhyuk's desk 43 hours after he'd made the call. 200 pages, meticulously compiled, and every document cross-referenced, every transaction traced, every lie exposed in black and white. Minjun stood across from him, tablet in hand, his expression carefully neutral in the way it always was when delivering information his boss wouldn't like. It's worse than we thought, Minjun said quietly. Junhyuk didn't look up from the first page. Explain? Zaria's biological mother, Diane Hale, died 5 years ago. Warehouse fire in the industrial district. South Harbor Storage, Unit 47. Official ruling, electrical malfunction. The building was old, wiring was faulty, sprinkler system failed. Suspicious? Extremely. The fire started at 2 a.m. Diane was allegedly doing inventory alone, no witnesses. Investigation was closed in 3 weeks. Minjun swiped to another screen. Insurance payout, $750,000. Junhyuk's eyes lifted. Legal guardian named in Diane's will, Marcus Hale, her husband of 2 years. A trust fund was established in Zaria's name, to be administered by Marcus until she turned 18. Minjun's voice went flat. It's gone. Almost completely drained. Show me. Minjun placed the tablet on the desk, displaying a spreadsheet of withdrawals spanning 5 years. Junhyuk's eyes scanned the entries, his expression darkening with each line. Educational expenses, $45,000. Medical needs, $38,000. Residential upgrades, $67,000. Therapeutic services, $29,000. On and on, neat, official. Approved by the court-appointed trustee who'd rubber-stamped every request. And school records? Junhyuk asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She hasn't attended consistently in 2 years. Multiple absences. No private tutoring, no college prep. Nothing that would justify $45,000 in educational expenses. Medical? No hospital admissions, no specialist visits, no prescriptions filled in her name. The $38,000 went into Marcus's account and disappeared into cash withdrawals. Jun Hyuk's jaw tightened. The residential upgrades? Kitchen renovation, new master bathroom, home theater system, pool installation. Min-jun paused. None of it in the room where Zarya slept. According to the housekeeper we interviewed, she was given the converted storage room in the basement. Silence filled the office like a physical presence. Jun Hyuk flipped to the next section. Bank statements, a business filings, debt documentation, and there, buried in the maze of financial desperation, was the connection that made everything click into place. Hale Import Solutions, he read aloud. Marcus's business. Import-export. Primarily electronics and textiles from overseas suppliers. It was struggling before Diane died, hemorrhaging money after. Min-jun pulled up another document. He used the trust fund to keep it afloat, faked the expenses, laundered the money through shell accounts, poured it into a failing company. And it still failed. Spectacularly. 6 months ago, he took a loan from Summit Logistics to cover a shipment he couldn't pay for. Jun Hyuk went very still. Summit is one of our subsidiaries. Yes, sir. Marcus Hale owes us $73,000. He's 3 months behind on payments. Collections sent the first warning letter 4 weeks ago. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't thrown Zarya into the snow because he hated her. He'd thrown her away because the money was gone and the debts were closing in. She'd gone from asset to liability the moment the trust fund hit zero. She wasn't useless. She was depleted. He discarded her like a used credit card, Min-jun said, disgust bleeding through his professional tone. Once he'd maxed her out. No. Jun Hyuk's voice cut through the air like a blade. He discarded leverage. Min-jun looked up sharply. Jun Hyuk stood, moving to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Below, the city pulsed with life. Deals being made, debts being collected, power shifting in invisible currents. A useless thing has no value, he said quietly. But leverage is everything. Marcus Hale stole $750,000 from a child and used it to prop up his own failure. Then, when creditors came calling, he eliminated the evidence. What do you want us to do? Jun Hyuk turned, and Min-jun recognized the expression. He'd seen it twice before. Both times, entire organizations had ceased to exist within a week. I want everything, Jun Hyuk said. Every account, every asset, every connection Marcus Hale has. And I want documentation proving every dollar he stole from that trust fund. And then we give it back to her. With interest. His eyes went cold. But first, we make sure he understands exactly what he threw away. Min-jun nodded, already moving toward the door. Min-jun, he paused. Begin quietly. No direct confrontation yet. I want him to watch everything crumble and not understand why. I want him desperate before we introduce ourselves. Yes, sir. Where do we start? Jun Hyuk picked up the file, his thumb running over the transaction list where Marcus had systematically stolen from a child who trusted him. His business licenses, trigger a routine audit, make sure they find every discrepancy. That'll take 3 days minimum. Good. Jun Hyuk's smile was winter. I want him to suffer slowly. Men who discard children don't deserve quick endings. Min-jun left, already making calls. Alone in his office, Jun Hyuk opened the file to a photo of Zarya, a school picture from 3 years ago. Bright eyes, hopeful smile, the face of a girl who still believed she was wanted. He closed the file gently. Marcus Hale had made 2 mistakes. The first was stealing from a child. The second was abandoning her on a highway where Kang Jun Hyuk would find her. The destruction had already begun. Marcus just didn't know it yet. The audit notice arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus Hale stared at the official letterhead from the Department of Commerce, his coffee going cold in his hand. Routine compliance review. The words were bland, bureaucratic, Nothing alarming on the surface. But Marcus had been in business long enough to know there was no such thing as a routine audit. Shit, he muttered, reaching for his phone. His accountant didn't answer. Neither did his lawyer. By Wednesday, federal investigators were walking through his warehouse, clipboards in hand, pulling files he'd forgotten existed. They were polite, professional, thorough, too thorough. Mr. Hale, can you explain this discrepancy in your import declarations from March 2023? These supplier invoices don't match the customs documentation. Your tax filings show revenue that doesn't align with your bank deposits. Marcus stammered explanations. Clerical errors, accounting mistakes, miscommunications with overseas partners. They wrote everything down with the kind of patience that made his skin crawl. Thursday morning, his business accounts were frozen pending investigation. He couldn't make payroll, couldn't pay suppliers, couldn't move money. His phone started ringing. Creditors who'd been patient suddenly demanding immediate payment. Suppliers canceling contracts. The bank requesting an emergency meeting about his loans. This is a misunderstanding, Marcus insisted to anyone who'd listen. It'll be cleared up in a few days. But Friday brought something worse. The local news ran a story. Local businessman under investigation for financial irregularities. The report was sparse on details but heavy on implications. They mentioned the audit, the frozen accounts. And then, almost casually, they referenced a trust fund established for a minor dependent. Funds withdrawn for educational and medical expenses that appeared questionable under scrutiny. Marcus's phone exploded. Former business partners distancing themselves. Community members who'd respected him suddenly silent. The private school where he'd sent Jason and Emily called about outstanding tuition concerns. His wife, Linda, looked at him across the breakfast table with something new in her eyes. Fear. Marcus, what did you do? Nothing. It's a mistake. Some bureaucratic confusion. But his voice cracked on the lie. By Saturday, social services had reopened the investigation into Diane's death. The warehouse fire that had been ruled accidental 5 years ago was suddenly under review. New questions about the insurance payout, about Marcus's financial situation before and after the fire, about the suspicious timing. Investigators showed up at his door with a warrant. They took his computer, his files, his phone records. Linda packed a bag and left for her sister's house, taking Jason and Emily with her. Until this is sorted out, she said coldly. Marcus stood alone in the house he'd renovated with Zaria's stolen money and felt the walls closing in. Sunday, the warehouse was seized as evidence. His business, already crippled by the frozen accounts, collapsed entirely. Suppliers pulled out. Employees quit. The building that had housed Hale Import Solutions for 12 years stood empty, yellow police tape across the doors. Marcus sat in his kitchen, surrounded by silence, and tried to piece together what had happened. This wasn't random. Couldn't be. The timing was too perfect, the destruction too systematic. Someone was doing this to him, but who, and why now? Then he remembered. The girl, Zaria, he'd thrown her out a week ago, left her on Highway 17 in a blizzard. He'd assumed she was dead, frozen, forgotten, problem solved. But what if she wasn't? What if someone had found her? What if she talked? Panic clawed up his throat. He grabbed his laptop, started transferring what little liquid assets he had left into offshore accounts. He packed a bag, clothes, documents, cash he'd hidden in the safe. He would leave, drive south, unchanged, cross the border, disappear until this blew over. It was 11 p.m. when he loaded the last bag into his car. The street was empty, quiet. His neighbors' houses dark. He pulled out of the driveway, hands shaking on the wheel. 2 blocks later, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. 1 car, then 2, then 3. Black sedans, moving in perfect formation. Marcus's heart stopped. They weren't police. Police didn't move like that. He pressed the accelerator, but the sedans matched his speed effortlessly. When he turned left, they followed. When he tried to lose them through a residential shortcut, they were already there, cutting off his escape. Finally, at an empty intersection near the industrial district, they boxed him in. Marcus sat frozen as the center sedan's back door opened. A man stepped out. Tailored black coat. Calm expression. The kind of presence that made you understand, instantly, that running was pointless. He walked to Marcus's window and tapped gently. Marcus lowered it with trembling hands. "Mr. Hale." The man's voice was measured, almost polite. "My name is Kang Jun-hyuk. I believe we have business to discuss." I don't know you." "No, but you know the girl you left to die on Highway 17. Jun-hyuk's expression didn't change. The one whose trust fund you stole. The one whose mother died in a very convenient fire. Marcus's face went white. "Get out of the car, Mr. Hale. We're going to have a conversation about value, leverage, and what happens to men who mistake children for disposable assets." It wasn't a request. Marcus's hands shook so badly he could barely open the door. Behind him, his car idled in the empty street. Ahead, the black sedans waited, and somewhere in a penthouse across the city, Zarya slept peacefully, unaware that the man who'd thrown her away was finally learning the cost of his cruelty. The destruction wasn't finished. It was just getting personal. The room had no windows, just 4 concrete walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light that hummed with mechanical indifference. Marcus Hale sat in one chair, hands trembling, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. He'd been here for 20 minutes, alone with his thoughts and the crushing realization that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The door opened. Kang Jun-hyuk entered with the unhurried calm of someone who controlled every variable in the equation. He carried a leather portfolio, set it on the table with precise care, and sat across from Marcus. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just studied the man before him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. Marcus tried to speak. "Look, I don't know what you think. Be quiet." The command wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. And Marcus's mouth snapped shut. Jun-hyuk opened the portfolio, pulling out documents one by one. Bank statements, trust fund records, withdrawal authorizations. Each paper landed on the table like an indictment. $750,000, Jun-hyuk said calmly. "Insurance payout from your wife's death, placed in trust for her daughter. You were named guardian and administrator." Marcus swallowed hard. That's legal. I had every right." "You filed for educational expenses totaling $45,000. School records show Zarya hasn't attended consistently in 2 years. Where did that money go?" She had tutors, private lessons." "Receipts, Mr. Hale. Show me the receipts." Silence. Jun-hyuk continued, his voice never rising. "Medical expenses, $38,000. No hospital admissions. No doctor visits, no prescriptions." He looked up. "Was she sick, Mr. Hale, or were you?" Marcus's face flushed. "I use that money for the business, to provide for the family, to give her a home." "A storage room in the basement." Jun-hyuk's eyes were ice. "While you renovated your master bathroom with her dead mother's money." "She had a roof over her head, food when she earned it. I didn't have to keep her at all." "No, you didn't." Jun-hyuk leaned back. "You could have surrendered her to the state. Let social services find her a home. Instead, you kept her because she was profitable. 750,000 reasons to keep her around." Marcus's hands clenched. "You don't understand what it was like. She was difficult, ungrateful, always moping around, making everyone uncomfortable. She was a child." The 3 words cut through the room like a blade. "A child whose mother died," Jun-hyuk continued, his voice dropping to something colder than the blizzard outside. "A child placed in your care. A child who trusted you. She cost too much. She cost nothing. The trust fund covered everything. You stole it and funneled it into your failing business. And when the money ran out, when my people came to collect the debt you owed, you panicked." Jun-hyuk's expression didn't change. "So you threw her away?" Marcus's face went pale. It wasn't like that. You pushed her out of a car in a blizzard and drove away. She needed to learn to die?" Jun-hyuk's voice was perfectly calm. "That's what would have happened. Hypothermia takes approximately 1 hour in those conditions, and you left her there to freeze to death because she was no longer profitable. I thought I thought she'd walk to a gas station, call someone. At midnight, in a blizzard, 16 years old, half-starved because you didn't feed her. Jun Hyuk closed the portfolio with deliberate care. You didn't think at all, Mr. Hale. That's your problem. Marcus leaned forward, desperation bleeding through. Look, I made mistakes, okay? But I can fix this. I can make it right. Just tell me what you want. What I want. Jun Hyuk's smile was winter itself. I want you to understand something very important. He stood, walking slowly around the table. I don't kill men for being cruel, Mr. Hale. Cruelty is common, predictable. The world is full of cruel men. He stopped behind Marcus's chair. Marcus went rigid. I kill men for being stupid. Jun Hyuk placed a document on the table in front of Marcus, a liquidation order. Every asset Marcus owned listed in neat columns. You mistook a child for a disposable asset, Jun Hyuk said quietly. You failed to understand value, and worse, you failed to understand leverage. What does that mean? It means you threw away something that belonged to me. Marcus's blood went cold. She's not. You can't. Sign it. What? The liquidation order. Sign it. Jun Hyuk placed a pen beside the paper. Every remaining asset you own will be sold. The proceeds will restore Zaria's trust fund, with interest, compounded annually at the rate you should have invested it. Marcus stared at the document, his hand shaking. This is everything. The house, the cars, my retirement accounts. Everything you stole from her. Yes? I'll have nothing. You'll have your life. Jun Hyuk's voice was absolute, which is more than you gave her. My family, Linda and the kids, are not my concern, though I suspect Linda is already filing for divorce. Tends to happen when federal fraud charges are pending. Marcus looked up sharply. You can make those go away? No, you earned those yourself. Jun Hyuk leaned down, his voice dropping. But I can ensure the investigation focuses on financial crimes rather than other possibilities. The fire, for instance, the very convenient fire that killed Diane and made you a wealthy man. Terror flooded Marcus's face. That was an accident. Perhaps, but investigations can go many directions, Mr. Hale, some more painful than others. The pen trembled in Marcus's hand as he picked it up. One more thing, Jun Hyuk said, as Marcus's signature scratched across the bottom line. You will never contact Zaria again. Not by phone, email, letter, or through intermediaries. If I learn you've so much as looked in her direction, this conversation will seem merciful in comparison. Marcus set down the pen, his face ashen. Jun Hyuk collected the signed document, sliding it back into his portfolio. You're free to go. Your car is outside. You have 72 hours to vacate the house before it's seized. And then what? Then you live with what you've done. Jun Hyuk moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. Bankruptcy, disgrace. The knowledge that you destroyed a child's life for money you couldn't even keep. Sometimes, Mr. Hale, survival is the harsher sentence. He left without another word. Marcus sat alone in the windowless room, the hum of the overhead light filling the silence. He'd walked in a businessman. He walked out a ghost. And somewhere across the city, Zaria's trust fund, restored, protected, and finally hers, waited for her to claim it. Justice, Jun Hyuk had learned long ago, didn't always require blood. Sometimes ruin was enough. The changes came slowly. First, Zaria stopped flinching when footsteps approached her room. It took 2 weeks before she could hear someone walking down the hallway without her shoulders tensing, without her eyes darting toward potential exits. By week 3, she stopped hoarding food. The kitchen staff had noticed immediately, the bread rolls wrapped in napkins and hidden in her nightstand drawer, the fruit tucked into her pockets, the way she ate like someone expecting the plate to be yanked away mid-bite. Mrs. Chen, the head of household, mentioned it to Jun Hyuk quietly. He'd simply nodded. Leave extra in her room. Don't comment on it. Eventually, the hoarding stopped. The hidden food remained uneaten. Zaria began to trust that breakfast would come again tomorrow. By the 4th week, she stopped apologizing for existing. And sorry had been her default response to everything. For being in a room someone entered, for asking questions, for breathing too loudly. The word had been beaten into her vocabulary like a reflex. Jun-hyuk had corrected it once, calmly. Don't apologize for things that aren't faults. She'd started to say sorry for apologizing, caught herself, and went quiet instead. He'd almost smiled. But if anyone expected Zarya to melt into the luxury surrounding her, to become some grateful, ornamental fixture in Jun-hyuk's life, they were disappointed. She didn't lounge by the pool, didn't spend hours shopping with a credit card she'd been offered and refused, didn't treat the penthouse like a fairy tale she'd stumbled into. Instead, she watched. When Jun-hyuk held meetings in his home office, she sat in the corner with a book, silent and still. But her eyes tracked the conversations. She noticed who spoke with confidence and who deferred. She observed how Jun-hyuk's tone shifted depending on whether he was negotiating or threatening. She learned that silence was a weapon when wielded correctly. One evening, Min-jun was presenting a logistics problem, a shipping delay that would cost them a significant contract. He'd outlined 3 solutions, each with drawbacks. What about rerouting through Busan instead of Incheon? Zarya's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. The room went still. Min-jun looked at her, then at Jun-hyuk, uncertain. Explain, Jun-hyuk said evenly. The port of Busan has less customs congestion this quarter. I saw it in the trade report on your desk yesterday. She met his eyes. The route is longer, but the processing time is 40% faster. You'd make up the distance and clearance speed. Min-jun pulled up the data, ran the numbers. She was right. Jun-hyuk's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. After the meeting ended, he found her in the library. You read my trade reports. It wasn't a question. I didn't mean to intrude. Don't apologize. He sat across from her. Why? She hesitated. Because I want to understand how this works, how you built this, how power actually functions instead of just exists. Most people in your position would want safety, comfort, escape. I had safety with the Hales. It was a lie. Her voice hardened. I want something that can't be taken away. Jun-hyuk studied her for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to his shelf, and pulled down a book, The Art of War, annotated in Korean and English. I start here, he said, handing it to her. Then we'll talk about Sun Tzu's application to modern logistics networks. She took the book like it was something precious. After that, she sat in on more meetings. Not as decoration, as a student. The underworld noticed. Kang Jun-hyuk, the man who never deviated from strategy, had stopped his convoy for a teenage girl. Worse, he'd canceled a critical merger to save her. He was keeping her in his home, protecting her. To his enemies, it looked like weakness. The Cheongsan crew tested him first, a minor territorial push into one of his distribution zones. Nothing major. Just enough to see if he'd respond or if his attention was divided. Jun-hyuk's response was surgical. Their crew leader's shipment was intercepted at the border. Customs found irregularities. Anonymous tip, of course. Their primary warehouse burned down the same night, electrical fire, no casualties, but total loss of inventory. Within 72 hours, Cheongsan was begging for a meeting to apologize. Jun-hyuk declined. 2 weeks later, the Hwang family made their move, stealing a client, undercutting a contract, spreading rumors that Kang Jun-hyuk had gone soft. Their accountant disappeared on a Tuesday, not violently, just vanished, along with all the financial records proving their organization's legitimate fronts were actually legitimate. The tax authorities received a very detailed anonymous package on Wednesday. By Friday, the Hwang family was too busy with federal investigators to worry about Jun-hyuk's reputation. The message spread through the underworld like wildfire. He hadn't weakened. He'd sharpened. Because now he was protecting something. And men protecting something they value don't show mercy to threats. They eliminate them preemptively. One night, Zarya found Jun-hyuk on the penthouse balcony, the city sprawling below them in a glittering web of light and shadow. They're testing you because of me, she said quietly. They're dying because of their own stupidity, he corrected. I didn't change. Their perception did. But you did change. You stopped the convoy. You canceled the meeting. He looked at her. Yes. Why? Snow began to fall, light and delicate, dusting the railing between them. When I was 11, he said slowly, someone opened a door that should have stayed closed. Saved a life that wasn't worth the risk. I asked him once why he did it. What did he say? That power without purpose is just noise. He needed a reason to be more than what the world expected. Jun Hyuk turned back to the city. You gave me a reason. Zarya stood beside him, no longer cold, no longer afraid. They think you stopped for a girl, she said. Let them think that. What did you actually stop for? His answer came after a long silence, quiet but absolute. Leverage. She smiled for the first time since the highway. She understood perfectly. Below them, the city pulsed with transactions and power plays and people who still thought Kang Jun-hyuk had made a mistake. They would learn. The girl he stopped for wasn't a weakness. She was becoming a weapon, and that changed everything. The snow fell softly that night, the kind of gentle descent that made the city look clean instead of dangerous. Zarya stood on the penthouse balcony, watching flakes dissolve against the glass barrier that separated her from the 100-foot drop below. She'd been living here for 2 months now. 2 months of warmth, safety, and the strange stillness that came from not having to brace for the next blow. But something still didn't make sense. The balcony door slid open behind her. She didn't turn. She'd learned to recognize his footsteps, measured, deliberate, never rushed. Jun Hyuk joined her at the railing, hands in his pockets, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. For a while, neither spoke. Then Zarya asked the question that had been building since the night he carried her from the highway. Why did you stop? He didn't answer immediately, just watched the snow fall, his expression unreadable. I mean it, she continued quietly. You canceled a meeting that took 6 months to arrange. You rerouted an entire convoy. You made enemies test you and had to destroy them to prove you weren't weak. She turned to face him. Why? Why stop for me? Jun Hyuk was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, rougher, like the words were crossing terrain he'd promised himself he'd never revisit. When I was 11 years old, I lived in the Buksong district. Do you know it? She shook her head. Factory area, shipping warehouses, the kind of place where people disappear and no one asks questions. He paused. My mother worked in a textile factory, 16-hour shifts. She left me alone most days. I learned to steal food from the docks to survive. Zarya listened, barely breathing. One day, I stole from the wrong shipment. It belonged to a crew running protection on the warehouses. They caught me. His jaw tightened. Their boss decided I needed to learn a lesson about respect, about consequences. The snow fell harder now, settling on the railing between them. They put me in a shipping container, Jun Hyuk said quietly. Standard 40-foot box, steel, no windows, one door. He looked down at his hands. They locked it, said I could come out when I learned my place. Zarya's chest constricted. I screamed for maybe an hour, pounded on the walls until my hands bled. Then I realized no one was coming, that no one cared. His voice went flat. The air gets thin in a sealed container. You don't notice at first. Then your head starts pounding. Your lungs work harder, but nothing helps. You get tired, so tired. How long were you in there? 14 hours. She felt sick. I'd stopped screaming by then, stopped moving. I was lying on the floor, just waiting, accepting. He turned to look at her, and she saw something raw in his expression. I had the same look you had on Highway 17, that exhaustion that comes from finally giving up. Someone opened the door, Zarya whispered. Someone opened the door. He nodded. A mid-level enforcer named Park Dae-jung. He wasn't supposed to be at the docks that night. Had no reason to check the containers. But he did. Why? I never asked. Maybe he heard something. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe he was just bored. Jun Hyuk's voice softened. He pulled me out, got me water, let me breathe. His crew wanted to put me back in. Finish the lesson. He refused. What happened to him? He was killed 3 years later. Rival gang. I was too young to stop it. Jun Hyuk looked back at the city. But before he died, he taught me something important. What? That the world is full of people who'll lock you in containers and walk away. Men who see other human beings as inconveniences to be eliminated. His voice hardened. But every now and then, someone opens the door. Not because they have to, not because it benefits them, but because they remember what it felt like to suffocate. Silence settled between them, heavy with understanding. You were someone's inconvenience too, Jun Hyuk said, meeting her eyes. To Marcus, to Linda, to everyone who should have protected you. They decided you were disposable. He paused. But you're not. You never were. Zarya's throat tightened. You stopped because you saw yourself. I stopped because I remembered. He turned to face her fully. Remembered being that 11-year-old boy who thought he deserved to suffocate, who'd accepted it as his fate. His expression shifted into something fierce. No one should accept that. Ever. The snow continued to fall, settling into her hair the way it had on Highway 17, but this time she wasn't cold. I've spent 20 years building power, Jun Hyuk continued, creating an empire where no one can ever lock me in a container again, where I control the doors. He looked at her steadily. When I saw you in the snow, I realized something. Power means nothing if you don't use it to open doors for others. Zarya felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but blooming. For 2 months, she'd told herself she was rescued, saved by chance, a fortunate accident. But standing here, listening to a man who'd built an empire from suffocation and survival, she understood the truth. She hadn't been rescued. She'd been chosen, deliberately, purposefully, by someone who understood exactly what it meant to be discarded. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate but all she had. Jun Hyuk shook his head slightly. Don't thank me. Just prove them wrong. Who? Everyone who thought you were disposable. His voice was steel wrapped in snow. Live, learn, become something they can never ignore. That's how you win. She looked out at the city, the sprawling web of light and power and possibility that had seemed so impossibly distant when she was freezing on a highway. I will, she said quietly. Gian standing there beside him, watching snow fall over a city that had tried to kill them both, Zarya felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Not hope. Hope was too fragile, too easily crushed. Purpose. The storage container had closed on an 11-year-old boy who became a king. The highway had abandoned a 16-year-old girl who would become something more. Neither of them would suffocate again, and anyone who tried to close the door would learn what happened when survivors decided to fight back. The snow fell, but they were warm, and that changed everything. 6 months changed everything. The convoy moved down Highway 17 in perfect formation. 3 black sedans cutting through fresh snowfall, headlights carving tunnels through the winter darkness. Inside the center vehicle, Zarya sat reviewing acquisition documents on a tablet, her finger swiping through financial projections with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent months learning to read between the lines of corporate language. Across from her, Min-jun was explaining a territory negotiation. The Incheon Group wants 20% of the Northern Distribution Network. They're claiming historical precedent. They have no precedent, Zarya interrupted quietly, not looking up from her screen. Their operation didn't exist until 2022. Cross-reference the shipping manifests from 2020. We've controlled northern routes since the park merger. Min-jun paused, pulled up the historical data, and nodded slowly. You're right. Counter at 8%, she continued, finally meeting his eyes. Frame it as generous considering their minimal infrastructure investment. If they push back, remind them that distribution access is privilege, not right. Jun Hyuk, seated beside her, didn't look up from his own documents, but the slight curve at the corner of his mouth was unmistakable. 6 months ago, she'd been dying on this highway. Now she was dictating terms on it. The transformation had been systematic. Jun Hyuk had enrolled her in business courses at the city's most exclusive private academy, not the kind where attendance was optional, but where rigor was currency. She'd attack the coursework like someone making up for lost time. Economics, corporate finance, strategic management, contract law. She studied the way other people binged television, obsessively, hungrily, like knowledge was oxygen she'd been denied too long. But the real education happened in Jun Hyuk's office. She sat in on negotiations with suppliers who tried to inflate prices, watched him dismantle their arguments with surgical precision, learned that leverage wasn't about volume. It was about knowing which pressure point would make the entire structure collapse. She observed strategy meetings where territorial disputes were resolved not with violence, but with economic dependency. Learned that the most effective threats were the ones you never had to voice aloud. And slowly, carefully, she began contributing. At first, in small observations, a discrepancy in a shipping timeline, a regulatory loophole no one had noticed, a connection between two seemingly unrelated market movements, then larger insights, strategic recommendations, alternative approaches to problems that had seemed intractable. The lieutenants had been skeptical initially, the girl the boss had stopped for, playing at business. But skepticism died when her suggestions worked, when her analysis saved them money, when her read on a competitor's weakness proved devastatingly accurate. Now, 6 months later, she sat in the convoy not as passenger, but as participant. The same highway stretched outside the tinted windows. The same snow fell in the same hypnotic patterns. But everything else had changed. Zarya glanced out the window as they passed the spot where she'd collapsed. And there was nothing marking it. No memorial, no sign, just asphalt and snow and the ghost of who she'd been. She remembered the cold, the numbness, the acceptance, the certainty that she didn't matter enough to save. Something wrong? Jun Hyuk's voice pulled her back. She looked at him, this man who'd stopped an entire convoy, canceled a critical meeting, and declared war on her behalf, who'd given her not just safety, but purpose, not just protection, but power. No, she said quietly, nothing's wrong. He studied her for a moment, then returned to his documents, trusting her word. The convoy continued through the storm, heated and secure, moving with the confidence of an organization that controlled outcomes rather than reacted to them. Inside, Zarya was warm. The trust fund Marcus had stolen had been restored, $750,000 plus interest. Sitting in accounts, she now understood how to manage. Jun Hyuk had taught her that money wasn't security. Money was tool, weapon, leverage. Security came from being indispensable. She'd enrolled in advanced courses for next semester, was already sitting in on acquisition talks, had started identifying inefficiencies in the logistics network that even Min Jun had missed. The girl who'd been thrown away for being expensive was becoming invaluable, and the man who'd stopped to save her was watching her become something he'd never expected. Not a project, not charity, not even gratitude. An equal. Snow continued to fall outside, the same snow that had nearly killed her 6 months ago. But this time, she watched it from behind bulletproof glass, wrapped in heated leather. I'm surrounded by people who would burn the world before letting harm reach her. The world had thrown her away, discarded her like trash on a frozen highway, called her a burden, an inconvenience, overhead to be cut. But the wrong man had stopped to look, the man who understood what it meant to suffocate, the man who remembered what it felt like to accept death as deserved, the man who'd decided that power without purpose was meaningless. He'd stopped his convoy on Highway 17 for a girl in the snow, and in doing so, he'd saved them both. Because Zarya wasn't the only one who'd been rescued that night. Jun Hyuk had spent 20 years building an empire with no reason beyond survival. She'd given him something more dangerous than wealth or territory. She'd given him purpose, and together, they'd become something the underworld was still learning to fear. Not boss and victim, not savior and saved, but two people who'd suffocated in different containers and refused to let the world close the door on anyone else. The convoy drove on through falling snow. Inside, Zarya smiled. She was warm, she was wanted, she was dangerous, and she was never going back to the cold. The highway disappeared behind them. Ahead lay only power. And the girl who'd once accepted death in the snow, she was ready to make the world remember her name. Thanks so much, my dear friends, for enjoying this beautiful story till this end. If you've not subscribed kindly, subscribe now to be notified when we drop our next story. Also, like the video and comment where you are watching from and what time it's at your end. Thank you. 6 months changed everything. Now the convoy moved down Highway 17 in perfect formation. 3 black sedans cutting through fresh snowfall, headlights carving tunnels through the winter darkness. Inside the center vehicle, Zaria sat reviewing acquisition documents on a tablet, her fingers swiping through financial projections with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent months learning to read between the lines of corporate language. Across from her, Min-jun was explaining a territory negotiation. The Incheon Group wants 20% of the Northern Distribution Network. They're claiming historical precedent. They have no precedent, Zaria interrupted quietly, not looking up from her screen. Their operation didn't exist until 2022. Cross-reference the shipping manifest from 2020. We've controlled northern routes since the park merger. Min-jun paused. I pulled up the historical data and nodded slowly. You're right. Counter at 8%, she continued, finally meeting his eyes. Frame it as generous considering their minimal infrastructure investment. If they push back, remind them that distribution access is privilege, not right. Jun-hyuk, seated beside her, didn't look up from his own documents, but the slight curve at the corner of his mouth was unmistakable. 6 months ago, she'd been dying on this highway. Now she was dictating terms on it. The transformation had been systematic. Jun-hyuk had enrolled her in business courses at the city's most exclusive private academy, not the kind where attendance was optional, but where rigor was currency. She'd attacked the coursework like someone making up for lost time. Economics, corporate finance, strategic management, and contract law. She studied the way other people binge television, obsessively, hungrily, like knowledge was oxygen she'd been denied too long. But the real education happened in Jun-hyuk's office. She sat in on negotiations with suppliers who tried to inflate prices, watched him dismantle their arguments with surgical precision, learned that leverage wasn't about volume. It was about knowing which pressure point would make the entire structure collapse. She observed strategy meetings where territorial disputes were resolved not with violence but with economic dependency. Learned that the most effective threats were the ones you never had to voice aloud. And slowly, carefully, she began contributing. At first, small observations, a discrepancy in a shipping timeline, a regulatory loophole no one had noticed, a connection between 2 seemingly unrelated market movements, then larger insights, strategic recommendations, alternative approaches to problems that had seemed intractable. The lieutenants had been skeptical initially. The girl the boss had stopped for, playing at business. But skepticism died when her suggestions worked, when her analysis saved them money, when her read on a competitor's weakness proved devastatingly accurate. Now, 6 months later, she sat in the convoy not as passenger, but as participant. The same highway stretched outside the tinted windows. The same snow fell in the same hypnotic patterns. But everything else had changed. Zaria glanced out the window as they passed the spot where she'd collapsed. There was nothing marking it. No memorial, no sign, just asphalt and snow and the ghost of who she'd been. She remembered the cold, the numbness, the acceptance, the certainty that she didn't matter enough to save. Something wrong? Jun-hyuk's voice pulled her back. She looked at him. This man who'd stopped an entire convoy, canceled a critical meeting, and declared war on her behalf. Who'd given her not just safety, but purpose. Not just protection, but power. No, she said quietly. Nothing's wrong. He studied her for a moment, then returned to his documents, trusting her word. The convoy continued through the storm, heated and secure, moving with the confidence of an organization that controlled outcomes rather than reacted to them. Inside, Zaria was warm. The trust fund Marcus had stolen had been restored, $750,000 plus interest, sitting in accounts she now understood how to manage. Jun-hyuk had taught her that money wasn't security, that money was tool, weapon, leverage. Security came from being indispensable. She'd enrolled in advanced courses for next semester, was already sitting in on acquisition talks, had started identifying inefficiencies in the logistics network that even Min-jun had missed. The girl who'd been thrown away for being expensive was becoming invaluable, and the man who'd stopped to save her was watching her become something he'd never expected. Not a project, not charity, not even gratitude, an equal. Snow continued to fall outside, the same snow that had nearly killed her 6 months ago. But this time, she watched it from behind bulletproof glass, wrapped in heated leather, surrounded by people who would burn the world before letting harm reach her. The world had thrown her away, discarded her like trash on a frozen highway, called her a burden, an inconvenience, overhead to be cut. But the wrong man had stopped to look, the man who understood what it meant to suffocate, the man who remembered what it felt like to accept death as deserved, the man who decided that power without purpose was meaningless. He'd stopped his convoy on Highway 17 for a girl in the snow, and in doing so, he'd saved them both. Because Zarya wasn't the only one who'd been rescued that night. Jun Hyuk had spent 20 years building an empire with no reason beyond survival. She'd given him something more dangerous than wealth or territory. She'd given him purpose. And together, they'd become something the underworld was still learning to fear. Not boss and victim. Not savior and saved. But two people who'd suffocated in different containers and refused to let the world close the door on anyone else. The convoy drove on through falling snow. Inside, Zarya smiled. She was warm, she was wanted, she was dangerous, and she was never going back to the cold. The highway disappeared behind them. Ahead lay only power. And the girl who'd once accepted death in the snow? She was ready to make the world remember her name. Thanks so much, my dear friends, for enjoying this beautiful story till this end. If you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe now to be notified when we drop our next story. Also, like the video and comment where you are watching from and what time it's at your end. Thank you.